We do welcome you back to NBS Television, your political command center. The conversation this morning will be around the World Refugee Day. Now, 20th June is marked almost, actually it's not almost, but every year. It is a time that the UN put in place for us to reflect on the refugee situation in our country. And as of this year, according to a report released sometime maybe 17 or 18 hours ago, there are 17 women, children, and men who are displaced worldwide, who have fled their own countries due to war, conflict, and persecution. Now, taking it back home to Uganda, Uganda is a host to 1.25 million refugees. Now, with this day hovering over our heads, we want to take a step with the refugees to protect the environment. And that will be the point of conversation this morning. Joining us to enlighten us on this particular subject is Onain David Ongwach, the Program Manager, Gender and Sexuality from Refugee Law Project, and of course, Devota Nue, who is a counselor for the World Refugee Council. Good morning, Devota.
Good morning.
How are you today?
Thank you.
Mr. Onain.
Morning.
It's a pleasure to have you. Welcome.
Pleasure. Thank you for hosting us.
My pleasure. Yesterday we had a couple of your colleagues discussing the Day of Elimination of Sexual Violence and Conflict. Today the conversation is around the refugees, taking a step with refugees to protect the environment. I'll start with you, Devota, since you're a counselor. Many people might not understand who a refugee is. So enlighten us who a refugee is and what is the difference between a refugee and an internally displaced person.
So, good morning, viewers. A refugee is any person who is forced to flee their home country because of war, persecution, or a natural disaster. And the difference between a refugee and an internally displaced person is that a refugee is forced to get out of their country for safety reasons, but for an internally displaced person, they are displaced from their home area and they have to move to another place. And an example is that in Uganda, we had internally displaced persons in Gulu, and then recently we had people displaced because of landslides in Bududa. Yes.
Oh, okay. Let's go back to statistics. How many refugees are currently in Uganda, and in how many districts?
Okay, so in Uganda we have 1.2 million refugees in Uganda, and then they are hosted in 15 districts. And they are basically hosted around the border areas, mostly in West Nile, in southwestern Uganda. And the districts include Arua, Gulu, Lamo, Kiriadongo, Isingiro. That's where we have refugees.
Okay. Mr. Onain, this year's World Refugee Day is focusing on refugees and environmental protection. How timely is this theme and how relevant is it?
Yeah, thank you so much, NBS, for hosting us once again, and for viewers for taking your time amidst everything you're doing to try to listen to us today. It is true we are commemorating World Refugee Day, but just slightly about us. We're a Refugee Law Project. We are an outreach center of the School of Law, Makerere University. And since 1999, actually, we are marking our 20th year of work with forced migrants, including refugees, asylum seekers, and deportees. So why is this day important? I think as we've all seen, and especially tying it to the theme, increasingly as a nation, we are seeing numbers of people leaving places they call home, going to places where they consider safe because of factors including national circumstances that forces them out of their countries. So as we commemorate this day, we also have to remember that there are some people leaving their homes because of circumstances besides war and persecution, but also because of circumstances that has to do with changes in their climate. So if we have to tie this day, and this theme brings us to the conversation, that if we want to tackle forced migration issues comprehensively, we also need to be addressing issues of climate change, issues of our environment. Otherwise, we risk with time seeing many more people. We have just seen recently Bududa, people have to be moved to Kiriandongo, and they have a place where they call Bududa community. So with time, even if we try to talk about this, we need to talk about environmental changes. And secondly, for us to achieve our country's development plan and the sustainable development agendas, we have to take care of climate change and our environment, because otherwise we need the air to breathe, we need to stay alive before being washed away by flood, we need to be able to plant our crops, and we have certainty that the sun will shine, it will rain, and it will grow. So for us to achieve our development agendas, we need to take care of our climate change, because otherwise we won't be there to achieve those goals. We will be long dead or washed away. And also, we're dealing with refugees, like you said. It's quite a big percentage of refugees in Uganda and elsewhere. But unless we talk about where are these refugees coming from and how many they are. We have just seen that they're 1.257.
Yes.
And 60% of the people forcefully displaced in Uganda, like 60% of the refugees, are children or people below the age of 18. So if we're saying climate change is a present and future agenda, and we say children are our future leaders, they are our future generation. So for us to hand over this mantle to them as a future generation, we need to hand over a planet that is safe for them as well.
Yeah.
So that means if 60% of refugees in Uganda are children, we recently commemorated the Day of the African Child,
Yes.
and it's very clear that children need to be engaged in some of this conversation, because otherwise, as we go back into the afternoon days of our life, we have to hand it over to children who have to continue pushing the agenda. But also, if we look at refugees and host in Uganda, a lot of initiative, including funding from the Netherlands, has been on how do we promote coexistence between refugees and host. And we know one of the major conflict drivers is around conflict over resource base, like access to fuel wood, access to water, and access to other services. So for us to promote coexistence between refugees and hosts, it's very important for us to be talking about some of the key factors also that leads into conflict. So this theme is just very timely and very important for us as we commemorate this day.
Okay, so now let's look at a couple of cases that have been pointed out, particularly in Lamour,
Right.
where there was a case of environmental degradation in a hosting environment or a host community. We want for you to point out something to us. One, should we say that the refugees did it, or the other people are cutting down the trees?
Yeah, when we say refugees are doing it and other people could also be refugees.
It could be the refugees or the members in the host community.
Yeah, I think it's an important question. Who is cutting the trees? I think it's important to say, okay, either way, refugees need to cook the beans and the cereals they're given. Hosts as well need to find the fuel wood to be able to cook whatever they have. So certainly we can't deny the fact that refugees have to get out of their 30 by 30 meter of land they're given to look for firewood. And so the hosts also have to do the same. And in the process of them looking for those resources, sometimes there are clashes. Like I said, there's sometimes conflict. So we accept that both refugees and hosts do the cutting. But while we answer this question, we also need to look broadly beyond cutting for daily subsistence. We have seen logging. We see big trucks coming out of refugee hosting areas carrying big trees. There have been a lot of momentum generated in the northern Uganda region that some of the trees which are very indigenous, they have significant value to the communities, are being cut down. So if we talk about cutting for cooking, yeah, it's important, but how about the big logging of the trees that should actually be able to help us regulate our windbreaks, should be able to give us better air for us to breathe. We've just celebrated the Environment Day, and we see that our air is really polluted, and Uganda is not doing very well. So while we see trucks coming out of refugee settlements, are they refugees cutting the big trees? Which refugee has a power soul to cut down the big trees? So while we talk about who is cutting, in terms of what we need to cook our food, we need to be talking about governance issues of how the trees move from those refugee hosting areas all the way to Kampala, what kind of permits people get, so that we do not lock damage of environment only to people really struggling to survive. So we need to tackle the big issues as well in terms of governance and control over logging and environmental degradation.
Okay. Devota, there's something that I want you to point out for us. Away from charcoal and wood fuel,
Yes.
what else or how else? Are there any alternative methods to food preparation, given the fact that UNHCR and World Food Programme take food to the refugees? Do you give them any other alternatives as opposed to, methods that in a way harm or hurt the environment?
Unfortunately, the common usage of fuel for cooking is we use charcoal and firewood. So it's not only refugees who use firewood and charcoal, and alternative modes of preparation of food. There is gas, and then there is also use of briquettes. So for the use of briquettes is use leftover food materials like maize corn, matoke peels. When they are dried up, you can use that as a cooking sauce. Unfortunately, is that most of the food that we prepare in Uganda is long. We have food like beans, we have food like matoke, and you find that people use, even a household here in Kampala, you'll not find someone cooking matoke using gas because they feel they are wasting fuel. So we have alternative sources of preparation like gas, but it's very expensive, right, for nationals and for refugees. The alternatives which refugees are using now is briquettes. Yes.
Let's look at,
Yeah, maybe just to chip in another bit.
Please.
Yeah, it's a good question to say what other alternatives have we got? I think while we're asking what alternative refugees do have besides using charcoal and fuel, we should be asking what alternative do nationals also have? What alternative do we as hosts have? It's not surprising, and for our viewers, I think it's also important for us to look into our closet and see, okay, we might have gas, but how many people traditionally cook matoke on gas? We still have gas, but we find homes also with charcoal. So it's a big conversation to say, okay, what alternatives do we have besides this? So it's important to talk about clean and reusable energy and use of briquette, but also as a nation, we need to be thinking proactively into the future that, okay, besides what we already have, what else do we have? Because studies have shown that even the demand of charcoal is far higher than the capacity for the people to supply. So that means if the consumption rate remains the same and the supply rate is increasing, and at the detriment of our environment, it's going to be a challenge. So we need to sit as a nation. We don't have to leave this to environmentalists. We don't need to leave this to NBS and other media people and researchers. But as a nation, we need to be sitting down to have very hard conversation. What do we do going forward? So renewable energies, yes, we see that, okay, improves charcoal stove, but we've also seen people leaving those stoves because they say, yeah, it doesn't cook very good food. The smell is really strange. I better go for this. So it also begins with trying to engage community members to begin to understand certain things a bit differently and let go of a few other things and embrace as we move forward, because otherwise it's going to be a challenge. So I believe, and we believe, it begins with a conversation like this and having to engage communities and trying to promote resilience that people do have so that we can together move forward. But otherwise, we end up bringing nice looking charcoal stove, putting it on people. Either way, they still use charcoal remains. For you to get those briquettes, you still need to use charcoal anyway. So we need to start that conversation so that we build on together. Otherwise, we end up dumping things on people. Then they use it for a few days, and when the media is there, they say, yeah, we have nice looking stove, but they don't continue using it. So it's an important question for all of us. And we need to be thinking about this on this day as we move forward as a country.
All right. Thank you so much, Mr. Omid. Devota, any other challenges that the refugees in the country encounter?
Yes, apart from challenges of getting fuel for cooking food, they have actually other day-to-day challenges. The most prominent challenge that we hear from refugees is livelihood. They do not have jobs to survive. They don't have money to parent, to afford tuition for their children, to actually also pay for health care. They also have a big challenge of language barrier. Most of the refugees hosted in Uganda come from some of the countries that we host. We have refugees from Burundi, we have refugees from Democratic Republic of Congo, and South Sudan, and they don't speak our language, they don't speak English. Some of them flee from Francophone. So you find that even accessing services and communication is difficult. Another big challenge refugees face, especially for those under 18, is education, access to education. In Uganda, we have a policy of universal primary education, and it's a very good policy. However, refugees have to buy scholastic materials. They have to buy books, and it's actually very expensive, even if it's a nominal amount like 20,000 shillings or 50,000, but you find that refugee parents are unable to afford or even food. Most refugee parents, when you talk to them, they're happy that some of their children are enrolled in school because at least they can have that 1 meal in a day in their school. Another challenge they face is is human trafficking, and this is especially for Somali refugees. So we get reports of refugees who are hoodwinked to go for human trafficking. They're looking for better opportunities in Europe, and so they are actually trafficked. Then another challenge we have is mental health, psychosocial trauma. Most of the refugees, I think in the discussion you had previously yesterday, we were talking about sexual violence, elimination of sexual violence. So most of the refugees hosted in Uganda come with trauma. They have post-traumatic stress, and you find that they need counseling, and they need to be given continual counseling to survive. Because you imagine someone is traumatized and they're expected to make a living here in Uganda. So they are in a new country, and then they also have to get livelihood. They have to survive, so they have additional challenges on them.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you too. Mr. Onin, something that we would like for you to help us understand, or something that I would like for you to help me understand, is the current refugee interventions seem to focus a lot more on the protection of refugees as opposed to the very reason they flee from their home countries. Why is this the case?
Yeah, thank you. And for viewers, these are questions that we keep coming across over and over, that instead of putting so much money in verifying refugees and understanding their numbers in the country, instead of injecting so much money in building roads that goes to settlements, that when refugees go back, then we can't use some of those resources, why don't we put that much effort and money to address the very reasons they leave their countries? I think that's a genuine question. It's a very good question for us to be thinking about. But we must also remember that as Uganda, as members of the international community, as humanity, we have the moral obligation. How would you watch a child drown in the river because they're trying to move from a place they feel very unsafe, going to safety? So we do not need the media to remind us that there's a Syrian refugee child who drowned for us to wake up and say, hey, it's a reality, it's a challenge. But we also need to historicize it a bit, the history of our country as well.